Okay, everybody. Well, welcome back once again. Hope you had an enjoyable spring break, and perhaps are still on it. This week, we're going to open Unit 4, which is about video surveillance systems, more commonly called camera systems. But we're going to refer to them as VSS, or video surveillance systems, because we are professionals, and that is what they're called. So let's just jump in and define these things. So what is VSS? It is not CCTV. It is not a closed circuit television system. You'll hear people refer to their systems as my CCTV system. That is really old school. It's like talking about your VCR when you're recording something. Video surveillance systems are on networks. They're on normally an open network, an internet protocol network. CCTVs are on closed backbones. In other words, everything is self-contained and you can't dial in. Essentially, you can't download things directly from these systems unless you're on the system. So there's a difference. VSS systems are primarily reactive in nature. They don't delay anything. Someone may be deterred by the look of a camera on the outside of a building, but they don't delay anything. Excuse me. There's no activity that they do to stop something from happening. So they are reactive. Even if it's within seconds that you're reacting, they are a reactive tool. VSS is a way to review what's transpired. Now, video analytics and artificial intelligence are making them much more real time. But again, the thing I want you to remember is these are reactive tools. It's very important to remember that. And an unmonitored camera is strictly an after-the-fact tool. And if it's on a CCTV backbone, it may simply be taken. And we'll go over that a little bit, kind of an interesting scenario to think about. So primarily there are two major components, if you will, to VSS systems: the cameras and then the box or recorder, or the place where those images are stored, be they digital images, be they files, be it actual tape. You need two components, essentially: the cameras and the box, the head end. Okay, we use that term again, head end, as we did with access control and alarm systems. The head end is normally the place where all of this stuff is stored. Okay. The evolution of cameras really began with the entertainment industry and motion pictures. The old silent movies formed the basis for modern surveillance cameras. Mr. Edison and others actually worked on these types of things, and since the 1890s they have been primarily the way we think about cameras outside of security. The military, though, and primarily the Russian military, back in the 1940s, and the Germans as well, began to use video surveillance, if you will, to watch weapons movements and to record nuclear testing and other things. So military use was pretty pronounced, and we'll find that with a lot of products that we use today. A lot of things started with the military. If you think about the internet as we know it, really was a military tool before anything else. Back in the 1990s or before, analog cameras were the big thing. They were tape-based, they were closed systems, and essentially everything was self-contained into one kind of operating unit. A camera went to a monitor so you could watch it, or a camera went to a VCR so you could tape it and watch it. But when digital came, and even before that, the VCR really made the industry blow up because there was a way to record this stuff. But multiplexers, another piece that we'll talk about, made video surveillance really practical because it allows you to watch more than one camera on a screen and record more than one camera on a single tape. Then the DVR came about, which many of you are familiar with because a DVR is generally the type of device that you had maybe a few years back and maybe still have in your homes when you record a quote-unquote record or download a video for watching on your TV. And then the NVR, the net VRs, moved in, and that really moved us to a true video surveillance system and away from the closed-circuit TV closed systems of the past. So there's a website here if you're really interested in the history of it. It's a pretty short read, but I think it puts it in perspective that the evolution of video surveillance systems is really heavily loaded toward modern day. There wasn't a lot of activity in cameras and camera technology between the 1890s and the 1990s, really. They were all, there were certainly more modern cameras, more people had cameras, and yeah, you had the Polaroid that used to shake, the picture, those types of things. You've probably seen pictures of people doing that in the 60s, but primarily nothing really moved. Everything was based the same until the VCR came out, and then on top of that, the net VRs and the DVRs that really turned everything digital. So if you're really interested in that, go to this website, take a look. It'll take you about 5 minutes to read it, but I think it might be something to help put it in perspective for you. Not mandatory. I'm not going to test on it, but it's kind of a gee whiz good thing to understand in this field. So this is an early version of a video camera. I think it says video camera on the side, simply because they didn't want to scare people, make them think it was some sort of a cannon to shoot at them. And you'll see some other cameras. We'll talk about some that actually look like cannons to me, but this is a very early, this is probably a 1950s to 60s version of a video camera, and most likely this looks like it's got some coax cable, maybe, or perhaps 2 power cords. Can't really tell here, but something of this vintage normally would have a spool inside, and it would be using real film, real silver-coated film like you would use to record a movie back on the old, in fact, this might be an 8mm actually by looking at it, 8mm film that you saw that when they recorded the Kennedy assassination, that was on an 8mm, guy was holding it in his hand. Mr. Zapruder was the gentleman's name who filmed that, in that famous film you see of the Kennedy assassination. And the same technology is used in these cameras, the 8mm film, and you would go and open up the back or the top, and you'd have to take the film out and put a new one in when it was time to change the film. And then we got a little bit more high-tech, and we started running these things over coax cable, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's the old style TV type camera, or cable rather. We now use Ethernet cables, and we use HDMI and several other types of technologies. Cat cable if we're using long runs, but for the most part, this was a coax based. This is a Pelco camera, stationary camera, probably black and white. I had the opportunity back in the late 80s to go to Pelco's one and only factory at the time. They've since been purchased, but before that, they had one factory outside of Fresno, California. Clovis, I believe, is the name of the town. And I will tell you that they threw away more cameras than they kept. Their quality standards were so high. If there was a little nick in the paint, if there was a little bit of a rough spot up in here on the housing somewhere, it went in the trash. They actually had the best cameras by far. And you will still then, because of that reason, see these Pelco cameras in this style in a lot of places. They're not a great picture anymore. I mean, the technology has stepped up so much. But you will see these cameras in a lot of places because they were just so darn durable, and you weren't going to break them. But with this style of camera, they had some limitations. If you wanted to look at multiple things, then you needed multiple cameras. And this is a pretty small tree here, but you will see camera trees like this with multiple cameras on them still today in places, especially old factories. If you're driving along and you pass an old, the auto industry was famous for this on their outside. They would have cameras going every direction, and you would have these trees. They look like with 7 or 8 cameras mounted on the same pole, pretty close to each other. So they had their limitations. They were fixed cameras that went one place, and you had to have many of them if you wanted to watch a panoramic view of any type of target. And they also didn't have built-in light sources. So in this particular case, you have an infrared light source that is toggled onto the camera, where modern cameras you'll see in future slide here that the IR is built in. I don't even know if that's an IR unit, but it is a lighting unit, and it simply provides lighting for the camera. It's not a bright light that you would see. It doesn't shine, but it simply provides an input, if you will, to allow the camera to see a distance. These old cameras, again, you will see them, and you'll see a lot of them. You'll be able to see them. They've got this really unique hood normally over the front to block out any light that's going to shine down on them. Pretty much an analog camera. People still use them. Some of them have been digitized in such that they use a video encoder that you can put in, but it's still the picture is not great. These things were not designed when modern lenses and digital photography was available. So in that regard, they're going to have fairly limited pictures. So in answer to the tree we saw before, we came out with a sort of dome camera. And this particular one is on a carousel, and it actually moves. It turns around so that you can look different directions if you need to. And rather than the modern ones where the lens may move inside of a dome, this entire thing actually moved. I love the fact that they put cameras on here as if you didn't know what it was. I guess if it scared you, just looking down at you. But this was indeed a fairly popular model of camera that was used to look at multi-views in a more panoramic way. But you had to stitch those images together essentially on monitors in order to see a wide area. So then out came the pan-tilt zoom camera, which is what this is. This unit here moves inside. If I wanted to look over here, I just have a control unit. It's like a joystick, and I turn it around, and I can zoom in, and I can see what's going on here, 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 here. This has a clear dome on it, which is why I used it for an example. It's a very old model, probably an early model of a PTZ, but I wanted to use it because it has a clear dome, and you can see the camera inside. Pan-tilt zoom cameras are used a lot these days. They're on a lot of buildings. You will see this type of dome hanging from what's called a parapet mount. We'll talk about mounts next week. But they're used a lot in industry. They're used a lot in casinos. But there are some limitations to PTZs, and they're not always the best. And here we have just a more modern camera, the ones you're more used to seeing. This is an Axis P model. I'm not sure which model number it is, but this is a movable camera inside, so it will turn around. They call them 360 because they go around in a full circle. They're actually 180 because they can't see what's above them. They can only see what's below them. So technically they're 180 in my opinion. But this is a more modern camera that you're probably used to seeing. And they're used just about everywhere. A lot of times you'll see them with a darkened dome, so you can't really tell where the camera's looking. You can if you get close. I do that a lot when I'm in a store and I see a camera. I go up and look at it very carefully. I will probably someday do that, and the store will be robbed that same day, and they'll come looking for me because I was the guy who was casing the cameras. So be it. I've usually got a pretty good alibi. So every person that comes to sell you a camera will tell you that pan-tilt zoom is better than fixed. Pan-tilt zoom is better than fixed. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. It is better for them because pan-tilt zoom is much more expensive than fixed. But the camera selection is based on task and purpose. Those are two important words. And in fact, when you install a camera system someday in your career, it would behoove you to make a short description, a spreadsheet, with each camera you want to put up, and to really spell out what the task and purpose of that camera is. Now, what is task and purpose? Task is what is it supposed to watch. So the task of a camera in this, let's see here, that scenario, the task may be to watch the warehouse entry from both sides, to scan the warehouse, right? That's the purpose of the camera, okay? And that's the task. The purpose of the camera, why is it watching that area? It may be because we have dangerous chemicals stored here. It may be because this is an area of high pilferage. It may be because we're trying to watch inventory. It may not be for security purposes at all. The task is what is it supposed to watch? The purpose is why is it watching that area? If you don't have a specific task and purpose for a camera, then you don't need that camera because you're not watching the right thing for the right reason. And really, what's the use? Task and purpose on every camera will be a question you will be asked, even in your project. So be prepared to tell me what is it supposed to be watching and why is it watching that area. So why PTZ or fixed? Well, it's a big decision. PTZ, pan-tilt zoom, covers more of an area. You can move the camera around with the joystick, right, remotely. But it's likely to miss an event if it's panning on a schedule, especially. So you set these things up on a tour, and you program in for 10 seconds, I want the camera to pan a little bit over to left to right, and then I want it to stop at the parking lot corner where there's been possibly some trouble. And I just wanted to stop there for a minute, zoom in on the corner where we know that kids hang out or something. And then if it's not, I don't see anything there, then it's going to come back and it's going to pan a little more. And then it's going to zoom in on something else. The issue that I found with PTZs is that when you have an incident, you're usually looking for 1 second, the spark of that incident, the catalyst of an incident. If there's an accident, you want to see the accident happen so you know who's at fault. If there is an incident where someone throws a punch in a parking lot, because PTZs are primarily used outside. We saw the application of it in a warehouse, but in a big area, somebody throws a punch at somebody. You want to know who threw the punch, right? You don't want to go 10 seconds later and see two guys rolling around on the ground in a fight. You want to understand how it started. And normally, a PTZ is looking someplace else when the thing you want to look at is happening. And it's too late. You can't stitch it together, right? You're looking to the left. The incident's happening to the right. That catalyst, that split second that you need to capture is to the right. Your camera's pointed to the left. So you're likely to miss an event when your camera is panning. Fixed, on the other hand, has little flexibility. They can't move when you're integrated with an alarm or event, right? Or when you're watching an event. So, same fight happens, and it's right on the edge of your camera view, and you pick up that first punch and you see it. And then the two people, the fight kind of moves a little bit 10 feet to the right, and they're out of camera view. That's when one of them pulls a knife on the other one. So you don't have that flexibility to follow the event once you've determined it's happening. So, there's a plus and a minus to each of them. PTZs are much more expensive to maintain. There are moving parts. Anytime you've got moving parts, you've got issues when it comes to maintenance. Fixed cameras are almost error-free. I mean, you really can't break these things. I mean, if you break the camera itself, true, but you can't have it pointing the wrong way. You can't overextend the motor because there's not a motor. You can't, the dome normally won't fog up on you because you don't need to have a dome. You have a clear glass over the front. They're pretty error-free. And privacy is a big issue. And I will tell you that I had pan-tilt zooms. This is a personal experience story. I had pan-tilt zoom cameras on a facility in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where the University of Michigan is. Some of you may be familiar. And right across the fence line from our facility was University Married Housing. They had married housing for graduate students. Big university, right? And I got a call from someone saying, how do I know the cameras aren't looking into our apartments? And with a fixed camera, I would have had it aimed right to the fence line, right? I wouldn't have been able to see anything beyond it really upward because, as you get farther away, things move to the top of the screen essentially, so I could have blocked that out. But when I went back and looked at the history, sure enough, a good portion of the guard's time, especially at night, was trying to peer into the windows of married housing. Quite embarrassing to have to, tell the university that this was going on. You can go through and block out certain pixels. So I went through and blocked out every window in the university housing area across from the fence line so that they could pan all they wanted, but they couldn't see in the windows because those were blacked out on their screen. But it is something that you have to consider with PTZ is that you may pick up things that people would consider to be private matters. And we'll talk in depth about privacy and cameras and systems in another unit. But you have to consider with a fixed camera, you know what you're going to see. With a PTZ, you could see just about anything. So digital enhancement is something that kind of makes me laugh because I see it on TV all the time. I love the one. There was a TV show. I think it was a CSI, one of the many CSIs that were on for many years, where someone was looking at a camera image. And they enhanced the image so they could see the reflection in a person's eye and see who they were looking at. Clear as a bell. That's a beautiful thing if it ever existed, but it does not. Okay? All VSS systems, all camera systems are pixel-based today. So the number of pixels doesn't change. Now when you see, the newer systems, there's just more and more and more pixels, so you get a clearer and clearer and clearer picture. But the number of pixels does not change. So when you blow up an image, essentially the pixels just get larger. Now I know we have a number of ROTC guys and former military guys in this course. You know that the military went to pixelated BDUs, the battle dress uniform. So for that very reason, so that on camera systems, it's very hard to pick those up, right? Or harder. But the pixels are little squares. So when you blow up something that's composed of little squares, you get big squares, and then you get distortion. So you cannot indefinitely blow up an image and not lose quality. So the TV is not telling you the truth. You can't capture a license plate number from 1,000 yards away, see that there's a license plate on that car, and assume that you can blow that up and read the numbers on that license plate. It doesn't work that way. You really have to match the camera to your task if you want very high resolution. Okay. If you put in the right camera, you perhaps could read that license plate from 1,000 yards away. It will be an expensive camera, but that's okay if that's what your task and purpose is to read these license plates because you want to know why people are in a certain area, or you want to be able to recreate who went in and out of a certain area in a vehicle. that task and purpose could be very valid, but you're going to need the right camera to do that. And most cameras, the vast majority of cameras that you will see out in the public, any place you go, do not have that type of resolution that could really blow up something to the extent that you see on TV. So, don't expect to get a camera image and be able to see me when we do a reflection in your eyes. It does not work that way. So what about lighting? And primarily we're talking about some limitations here on cameras, because I want you to understand the limitations, and I want you to be able to explain those to your future boss when they say, just put a camera up because we'll be able to see everything. Some lighting, we talked about low pressure sodium lights, right? The yellow ones that you see on the side of a lot of warehouse buildings, right? They're bolted on the side, usually kind of angled down. Really good for a marker, general use to see what you're doing, so you can see someone if they came up, with your naked eye. But they distort colors, and primarily reds and greens. Reds will look green, greens will look red if you have a color camera. Be wary of colors recorded at night with any camera. Okay, there are a lot of factors in cameras that can change colors, even slightly, so that it would be hard for you to say a person was wearing a bright yellow versus a tan jacket, or a pink versus a purple shirt. A lot of the colors get distorted at night, and there's a lot of factors, including the lighting, the lens, the settings on the camera, the type of IR you're using. For that reason, a lot of old camera housings, a lot of the old cameras, those big giant ones that look like, Canons, excuse me, had both color and black and white cameras built in, and at night they would switch over. So, as soon as it got to be twilight, you'd start to record in black and white and view in black and white. And then in the morning, when the sun came up, it would change back over to color. There was one particular one, and I'm trying, if I remember the name, I will get a picture of it, I promise, because it's really cool to see. There was one person who made these things, and they put a full-size color and black and white camera in. They were the first ones to do it. And this camera was literally 3 feet long and almost a foot in diameter. It was round, and it really did look like you had a big gun turret on the top of your facility if you had them on corners. People would put them on the corner of the facility pointing out toward parking lots, and it looked like you were going to shoot somebody. It was really kind of a funny looking thing. But that was one of the first ones because you needed to switch to black and white when it got dark. Now, infrared's a best option, the IR that I talked about. It can light the camera view without lighting the room, right? So if you have a camera up outside and it's completely dark, the IR will allow the camera to see, but it won't allow the person to see that you're seeing them, okay? It doesn't shed a light on things. It just allows the camera to see in the dark, but it doesn't brighten the area at all. So for areas like, rooms, interior rooms that you want to see at night and you want to understand what's going on, if somebody comes into the dark room to do something, you'll be able to see them, but it won't light up the room. They won't be able to see you and know that you're watching them. So infrared is the best to use. And you'll see infrared cameras normally have a ring of little lights. They look like little LED lights around the lens. They will often shine in red color. You can see them from a distance, and that is the infrared system on a camera to light it up in very dark areas. So how about weather? Indoor cameras can be used indoors. I mean, by definition, right? But you should only use outdoor cameras outdoors, okay? People will put indoor cameras outside. They'll put them under an overhang, like a roof overhang, or in some little protected cove, if you will, on the side of a building. They're always disappointed. Moisture gets into, they're not sealed cameras. Moisture gets into indoor cameras, and you will spend a lot of money changing them out. And normally they're in the worst possible places because you're trying to put them someplace where they're protected. And so they're up high and they're under an overhang, and you have to get a lift to get to them and that type of thing. Use outdoor cameras outdoors. Remember that always. Outdoor cameras need a heater when it's cold and when it's wet. So in Arizona, you might be okay with a dome camera outside that doesn't require a heater. But if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're in Michigan, if you are even in Kentucky or Tennessee or somewhere in Missouri where the weather can be hot and cold, you're going to need a heater inside the dome. 2 reasons. Number one, so the camera itself can move. Remember, these are moving parts, so they need a little bit of warmth so they don't freeze in place. And number 2, you'll get condensation inside of a dome. No matter how well they're sealed, after time, there's just a small leak that comes in. somehow, and you're going to get some condensation. The heater will come on automatically when there's moisture detected, and will clear the condensation. Otherwise, you'll be looking through a fog. It'll be looking like you're looking through the windshield when you don't turn your defrosters on when it's foggy outside. So you really want to make sure you have a heater in an outdoor camera, and I would suggest you do that in all but the most extreme places. I know people in Florida that put them in because you get the condensation issue there. And then remember, when you put a camera up and you talk to your installer, make sure you specify that they need to insulate the connections. So a lot of times cameras today, and we'll go over the hookups in a bit here, are just connected directly into an internet connection, right, into an Ethernet. And those aren't always rated for outdoors, and if you're going a short distance to connect it inside the building, you still want to make sure it's insulated, right? So if you're using an outdoor camera, insulate your first connection to make sure that it's weatherproof. Even if it's not exposed directly to the elements, it's just a smart thing to do so no moisture can trace down the insulation on the wiring and get into your connection, short out your camera, and then you'd have a problem. So, indoor cameras indoor, outdoor cameras outdoor. Don't rely on putting an indoor camera outside because you think it's going to be protected. It doesn't work that way. Always consider a heater unless you're in a really extreme situation. It's just a smart investment. It's a couple $100. Somebody will say, heater, we're in Miami. Yes, it gets very humid in Miami, and humidity can be dried up by that heater. And just remember to insulate your connections so that you don't have to worry about going back and fix that later. And one final point on the cameras themselves, think about your field of view. When you're setting up a camera, I have seen so many cameras set up where when we put it on a monitor and we look at it, it is covering a whole lot of stuff on the ground, but it's also covering 30, 40, 50% of the screen is the sky on an outdoor camera, or the ceiling on an indoor camera. Above the height of a person or above the height of the resource you're trying to watch is pretty much lost space. Unless you think that there's a vulnerability above it, it's lost space. So don't have too much sky and too much ceiling. Think about what you really want to see and try to get that into your view. Consider overlap. If you have more than one camera that can cover something, then perhaps you've got too much, right? Unless you're looking at it from a different angle for a specific reason, try not to have cameras that overlap each other. Especially pan-tilt zoom cameras, when they get locked and they're looking at each other, is just the silliest thing in the world. Try to make cameras so that they are independent of others when it comes to their view, so you can get the most bang for your buck. Finally, I like to consider digital fisheye lenses, which are really coming into their own now. Fisheye lenses have been around for a while. They basically give you a wider view. They're a wide-angle type lens, okay? Named after the fisheye because the fish can has the eye on the side of its head and they can see all around that one side of their head, right? But they've come into their own for one important reason, and that is that they can now be digitally enhanced to flatten them out so you don't get that really weird curve anymore. Let's take a look at a fisheye lens real quick, just to give you an example. So here is a fisheye lens in a retail setting, and if you notice how wide that picture is. Now, around here you'll see there's a curve, right? And that curve can be flattened out. It can be digitally changed in the system itself to flatten that out so that everything looks as it would normally without losing any of that wide angle. That's why a fisheye lens is really a good thing for you to consider in the future, because I think that they really will enhance your ability to look at wide angles, and just something for you to think about. So there's a lot more to learn about cameras themselves. I've got a website at the end of the lecture to show you, but I really want to talk about the recording and control equipment. And next week, as we talk about placement of cameras, we'll be talking more about the styles of cameras as well. So that's not it. I wanted to give you the history on those. But the images have to go somewhere, right? The camera has to send it someplace normally. And so the head-end equipment really has evolved over the years and changed quite a bit. The very early systems held the film. You saw that old green camera there. The film was inside on a spool, right? Looked like a little movie reel like you'd seen in the 1940s. The VCR really changed the game. But when VCRs came out, they had to have one camera to one VCR to the monitor. And if you wanted to have more cameras, you needed a VCR for each one. that get really expensive because VCRs nowadays, if you can find them in a thrift store somewhere, you can get them for about $10. When the VCRs first came out, they were running probably around $400 to $500 each for a home model. For a better, higher end model like you'd want to use in a security system, you're probably talking twice that. So, for a small business, they were a real investment. And if you had to buy one for every camera, well, that pretty much became an issue. And I do remember working in a building in North Carolina. It was actually the headquarters for GlaxoSmithKline, where they had a huge room that was nothing but wall-to-wall VCRs, and there were 3 guys whose jobs it were to just go and change the tapes. It was a very large campus they had there. It was their headquarters campus. They just went around changing tapes all day. The multiplexer was a game changer. And the multiplexer is something that you take for granted now, but on a screen you could put more than one image. And more than one image on the screen meant that you could record more than one image on one tape. So when you added a multiplexer to that VCR combination, it allowed you to record multiple cameras on one tape. You couldn't really enhance much, and you couldn't really, fast forward one to the other. You had to, jockey them around on the screen a little bit. But that was really a game changer because you could, with one VCR, you could normally put 16 cameras onto one VCR tape and watch it on a single monitor, albeit very small. So just like, with the cameras, the video systems, motion pictures were the basis for all these systems. You had banks then with silver film on a spool, just like that green box. Retail really got into video surveillance when VCRs came in, and they were based on a loop system, so that with the ones that you used for surveillance, once the tape got to the end, it would rewind itself and start recording over. So it was the first in, first out kind of scenario, and you were able to keep at least a limited amount of data on your VCR tape. With big systems, multiplexers made surveillance more practical, right? You didn't want that room full of VCRs like Glaxo had. They were a very, very rich company. They were able to do that, but most companies wouldn't have more than one VCR. They would just go with one camera. The multiplexer really changed that. And then digitization brought in the DVR, the digital video recorder, which you may have on your TV set still today if you have somebody like Comcast or Spectrum. And then the NVR, which actually records it remotely somewhere else, and you pull it off the cloud. And then the Internet of Things is really bringing more reliance on edge devices, and we're finding that some of those boxes may or may not be required. And we'll get into that here in just a second. So here you go. Here's a camera. There's a lens and a camera. It would go, the camera would be plugged in for power. It would go by coax cable to a VCR, coax cable out of the VCR into a monitor, and you could watch it if you wanted to. Everything was running on independent power, and essentially one camera, one VCR, one monitor unit. That was the original small retail business kind of video surveillance system. The downside, and actually these are CCTV systems in reality. We're trying to get away from that word, so I'm not going to mention it too much, but they were closed systems. But you required one camera, required one VCR. Big downside, huge cost, right? Tapes filled up, needed to be changed and saved if you wanted to review them. If you didn't want them to tape over, if you were in certain industries where you were required, like banks, required to keep a certain amount of data, the tapes had to be changed at least once a day, because that's what they would hold, because even if they were set to only record things that moved on motion, which even those old systems could do, in a bank, people are coming and going all day, the system's running most of the day. Big problem with them were independent time date stamps. You set the calendar, the time and date in the system. And if the system lost power for anything, how many of you have old, alarm clocks, if you're still using those? I know I don't. I use my phone, but remember the old alarm clocks and the old devices that when there was a power failure, it just flashed 12. Well, that would happen. You got any kind of power bump and your time date stamp would go away. When you try to use that video in a court case, it didn't have a time date stamp, or even worse yet, when daylight savings time would come up, when there was a leap year, anytime there was a change, even some of those more modern systems, if you will, when there was a power bump, it would just reset to January 1st at midnight, but it wouldn't flash. It would just take up from there. So you're in mid-June and you're recording a video and the time date stamp says it's the middle of the night on January the 4th. That would really hurt you in a court case. A lot of court cases were thrown out because the time date stamp on the video made it inadmissible. So, that was a huge downside to those. and the entire system could be taken. So think about it this way. If you had a retail store and you wanted video surveillance because you wanted to make sure that if someone broke into your store at night, you caught them, right? You got them red-handed, you got them on film, they're going to jail. Except if they take the camera and the VCR with them. And these systems had value. And in fact, they were as valuable as any one particular item in the store normally. If you had a retail store, let's say a convenience store, the most expensive thing on your shelf is probably a bottle of aspirin that you're overcharging $10 for when it only costs $3. The rest of it, you've got, bottles of soda and coffee and, snacks, right? That's the most expensive thing you've got is that camera system. Well, if someone broke in at night, they would just take the camera system with them because it was a closed system, a closed circuit TV system, and no one would know till they came in the next day and saw the wires hanging. So the other problem with these systems are because they weren't real accessible, you had to go to the system itself and physically work on that system. No warnings, nothing could be sent to you via your phone or anything like that. They were usually ignored soon after installation, and you had tapes that broke, time date stamps that didn't work, things that were just flashing 12 and weren't working at all, and you went back when you had an incident, looked at it, and you said, the VCR failed, the system failed, these systems are garbage. Really, it was a matter of the fact that they were just ignored. So that was a huge downside. So we improved on these systems by using a multiplexer, right? We now have multiple cameras, and they go into a single device, which is a hard disk recorder normally now, right? Still some VCRs operated on these systems, but even with a DVR, okay, you had multiple cameras into a single box and then to the monitor. Huge improvement over the 1-to-1 ratio that really made these things not so cost effective, but these too had their downside. The monitors themselves weren't often changed. When I say the monitor, I'm talking about that TV set that guard or that security professional or whoever was looking at. They didn't normally change those out. They multiplexed the image, and the images became so small you couldn't see anything on them. But security managers wanted to watch everything because now they could watch everything because they could multiplex all these cameras so every camera could be up on their screen. And then I have been even recently in multiplex systems where I've looked where we have one person watching cameras and there are over 200 cameras up on a wall. There could be a murder going on in a camera in the lower left quadrant of that screen, and if they're looking at the upper F quadrant, they're missing a murder, right? They became more expensive when they got, though, to the digital side, right? Because, computers were more expensive when these things first came out. And a lot of people just dropped the system. They said, we're going to keep this old VCR-based system until it dies, and then we're done because we're not going to be in that game and get high-end equipment. And they still require dedicated wiring from the camera to the DVR. So every single camera had to come back with a home run, if you will, back to that DVR. So if you had a facility like a large warehouse, you had to run cabling from that camera all the way back to that DVR, and then from the DVR, a single cable then to the monitor if that was in a different room. But if you had 20 cameras in a warehouse, you had 20 pieces of coax coming all the way back to connect. So then we evolve and we add this one little line right here. And that is that we put the recorder, which is now an NVR, a networked video recorder, as opposed to a simple digital video recorder, but now it's networked, and we drop that on the internet. That means we can watch this from just about anywhere. Opened up a whole new world for us because you could sit in another city then and watch the cameras. You didn't have to be at this monitor, the hardwired back one. You didn't have to have a long line, right? You're using the internet connections to watch it, so you could do remote monitoring. And this is primarily the model that was used and is still used by people like ADT. When they will watch your cameras and your alarm system for you remotely, they're doing it this way. They put a device in at your location, and they just tap into that device. It could be a server, right? It doesn't need to be a specialized device anymore. It could just be a simple server that is tapped into, and it goes over the internet. But these still weren't perfect systems. There were still a lot of dedicated wires. And in fact, we just added a wire to that one we were complaining there's wires running all over the place. We added one, another network connection at the the NVR itself. So it still required a box. It still required a piece of hardware, which could be a very expensive piece of hardware, ranging anywhere from, for a small one at about $6,000 or $7,000 to a very large high-end one could be close to $50,000. to hold your data. And they had limited memory. You could buy memory, right? Memory is cheap. Any of the computer science majors in the course will tell you that memory is cheap. You can get plenty of it. But if you had to put it in one place, it's still, you're adding hardware, and adding hardware gets expensive and it needs care and feeding out in the field. So unless you upgraded it and added a lot more, you had limited memory. Archiving required an action as well. So you're archiving from the box. So you had to back it up, normally to removable media because of bandwidth. So you're putting these things in a retail business that wants to make minimal investment. They want to protect themselves from crime, so they make a decent investment in an NVR and camera system. But they don't want to make a huge investment in network connectivity. And so you're trying to download a whole lot of video over the internet, and not everybody's set up like Netflix, right? These systems were not optimized for bandwidth, and therefore when you back them up, you normally backed it up locally to a removable media. You put it in a data stick, or you put it onto a DVD. Somehow you backed up that data onto a piece of movable media that was there at the site. So it required a lot of activity at the location, even though you could watch it from somewhere else. Which leads us to the more modern system. And I say this is the more modern system, and I could finish that sentence. There could be a better one that comes out tomorrow. That is how quickly, as we all know, the Internet of Things is moving. But in this particular scenario, we have a camera, and we have multiple cameras. They plug into power over the Ethernet. So they're running the power over the cable connectivity that's going to put them on the network immediately. So think about plugging in your internet connection through a wire, or you could even do it wirelessly, right? And use an injector. You could just plug this into any outlet essentially with an injector, and it will power the camera. Wirelessly or over an Ethernet cable, you're connecting it directly to your network. Okay? It's an Internet of Things device. On the camera itself is an SD card. And if you're not familiar with an SD card, it's just a little small thing that normally went into a digital camera, right? It's a piece of removable media. It's a little storage device, and it's a card about 1 inch by 1 inch. And you actually put that on the camera itself. It records to the SD card, and you can access the card via a web portal. So you have a monitor, and you have a camera, and everything else that takes place here is taking place away from your site. You have no other device to put in, and the clarity is amazing. But the idea is that you are reducing the amount of hardware in the field, and anytime you install a system for your future employer, you should consider reducing the amount of hardware in the field, because it's the more economical way, and certainly going to be a lot less work for you to worry about all the parts that could be in the middle. So let's talk a little bit more about these systems as well. So just like the others, what's the downside? Well, I'll tell you, I'm still looking for it. I'm sure that there is a downside that's going to come back and haunt me someday, but I am converting a lot of systems to this type of technology, to an edge device technology, as it's called. An Internet of Things device. It sits on the edge of your network and then connects to the outside world, commonly referred as an edge device. And I apologize for those of you, again, that are computer science majors. I'm making this very simple, but I'm a simple guy and it works for me. But I'm not finding the downside to these systems, but I am finding some really great benefits. So some of the benefits really are that some of these systems, and there's one manufacturer, Verkada, whose system actually has on board, it's got a whole computing unit on board, right? It's like a PC inside of a camera. And it can hold 1 year of constantly recorded video on the camera itself. So even if you lost everything but power, as long as the camera is powered, if you lost every bit of connectivity, you could hold 1 year's worth of video right on the camera itself. The recorder's built into that dome. Most of them hold a lot less because they're not as sophisticated. They want to keep the prices down. But I have not found any that can't hold 30 days worth of motion sensing images. So it's only recording when something moves. Otherwise, it's not recording. And why would you want to record stuff that isn't going on, right? So it's recording motion. It will give you at least 30 days worth at a very reasonable quality of video. The SD card that's in the camera itself can be removed. So if you have a court case and you say, do you have the video of that? You review it and you say, okay, I've got it. You can go to the camera and remove that SD card, put a fresh one in, and now you have that video in your hand. You can lock it up and it will be archived forever because it's on that device. You can take the original piece of video file with you to court. a big advantage to these things is their two-way communication. So just like you talk about an Alexa device, right, or a Google Home or one of those types of assistants, right, that you have at home, you communicate with it and it communicates with you. The same is true for these edge devices, these cameras. And the big advantage to that is when there are security issues with the firmware or patches needed on the camera, changes, things you need to protect, rather than have to try to get them into your system and you upload them to every camera. And I will tell you that I've not met a security manager, myself included, who's done that very faithfully and done it very well, and some have ignored it for years. Instead, the system will take that information from the internet, pull it down. It's pushed to the camera. So your cameras are constantly updated with the latest and greatest security patches. Nobody's going to use your camera to break into your network. They're not going to come in from the outside through that device because the patches and things are automatically uploaded to the camera. They're pushed down to that camera. And the SD cards can be watched. So you go to a website. When you buy your camera, you buy a certain amount of storage space with it. And you just go to that manufacturer's website and they have a password. You have a password, you get on and you go to your cameras and you can look at them live. Or you can archive that if you want to save your video for more than 30 days. Or if you just want to back it up and keep copies of it, you can upload those to the cloud automatically. As long as you have the bandwidth to do that, and you just do it off hours. You set it up on a schedule if you want. But essentially, nothing leaves the camera until you want it to. And the cameras stay constantly protected from cybersecurity attacks because patches and things are downloaded and pushed to them. The current camera scenario in the US when it comes to security cameras is normally that the cameras themselves sit on the network that is your proprietary network, and they're pushing down to an NVR, and from there it's part of the normal industrial network, if you will, of your facility and your company, and that device sitting on the edge is vulnerable. It needs to be properly password protected. We'll talk about that next week, but this really solves for that issue. So a couple things I'd like you to do this week if you have the time. And there's a fair amount of reading. I won't say it's all that much, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But I'd like you to go to Axis Communications website, and I've got that listed a little deeper in the lecture. A couple slides. Only got a couple left here. They're not the only game in town. Look, Panasonic makes a good camera. Sony makes an excellent camera. There are lots more, but they have a nice array of cameras. And I want you to look at their models and the features. You'll be able to find those features on other people's cameras. There's no question. I want to make sure you understand this is not an endorsement. But when you design your warehouse project, if I just said put a camera up, I'm going to ask for model number so I know what features that you think you're going to get from that camera. And so if I just opened it up to any camera manufacturer, I would need to go look at thousands of models. You would tell me a model of a camera that I'd never heard of before. I'd have to go dig to try to figure out what that model does. If we use one manufacturer's models, I know pretty much what Axis cameras do, and therefore it'll be much easier for me to find, the intent of what you're trying to do. So it's not an endorsement, but please go to Axis. We're going to use their cameras just for simplicity's sake. I like them, by the way, so it's not an anti-endorsement either, but there are other good ones. While I have you on this subject, I do want to mention, especially for those of you who have designs on government jobs, there is a brand of camera called Hikvision, Hikvision, and you will see them advertised a lot online. Hikvision cameras are owned by the Chinese government, and the prevailing wisdom is that they have the special chip in them so that Beijing can see everything on the camera if they so desire. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I know that the U.S. government, and particularly the Department of Homeland Security, has banned Hikvision cameras from all government facilities. And so I would be very cautious if you were going to design a camera system using Hikvision cameras, and that is an anti-endorsement, and I guess the folks at Hikvision can sue me if they so desire. But the onus is on them to prove me wrong on that statement. But Axis is what we're going to use for this project. So let's just go there, take a look at the different models, get a little familiar with the type of camera that you might want to use. It's a pretty good website with a lot of little videos on clips of what the cameras do, so it might help you. A couple of parting thoughts when it comes to camera systems, and then we'll review what to do this week and what we're going to do next week. So next week, indeed, we're going to look at the application of cameras. Where would you put cameras? What type of camera would you put where? How do you match your environment and your task and purpose? Make sure you remember what those are, right? To the actual camera type itself and the type of recording device you want to use if you want to use a device. I want you to promise to never say CCTV unless you mean it. CCTV is an old VCR normally or other type of closed system. Once they got onto the network, they were VSS, video surveillance systems. And you will only in your career deal with video surveillance systems because I would venture to say you would have to go to an antique store to find a closed circuit TV system. But you will still find people, finance people, your own boss at some point is going to say, well, what about the CCTV? Be polite, but correct them. You mean the video surveillance system? Yeah, it's not a CCTV anymore, boss, because it's it's a network system. So it's a VSS. VSS told us this or that. Promise never to use fake cameras, ever, ever, ever. You will find these. I grew up in New York, and I'll tell you, every little shop and liquor store, not that I've ever been in one, but they had fake cameras. They were on a little motor. They would go back and forth. They'd have a little blinking red light on them, and the lens was such a dummy lens that you could see right in it. There was nothing there, but they would go back and forth on a little motor, and they would normally make a little bit of a noise just so that you'd look up and see them. Don't ever use fake cameras. And the reason is that people have an expectation of security when they see a camera. They expect that if something happens to them in that environment, that camera will be something that will be able to be used reactively to help solve the crime that was committed against them. If you have a fake camera, you have indeed given them a false sense of security, which is something that can be a big liability. Never do that. While I was thinking of that, there's a similar thing for alarm systems on homes. It's called the lick and stick. And a lick and stick is what we use in the industry to mean someone who says, I want to have the appearance of home security without having it. And there are some small alarm companies out there that will still sell a lick and stick. You call them and say, hey, I want somebody to come out for a home security system, but I don't want to spend any money on it. Is it possible, can I get one of your signs? And what they do is they send a salesman out because they hope to change your mind. But if not, he will sell you a handful of stickers to put on your windows to say this home protected by a security system, and one of those little things you put in the yard by the door that say you have a security system. You will notice that those things never have the name of a security company on them, because no security company in the right mind wants to have the liability of saying that their system was in place when it was not, and there was a crime committed. So, the same with never use fake cameras, never use fake security signs either. Really, really bad business. And VSS is not a miracle cure. Be sure to manage expectations with your future bosses when they talk about, well, we had a camera system. Why didn't the camera system? You need to manage the expectation before an event happens to make sure they understand that the camera is something that's reactive. It has to be in the right place at the right time. If it's a PTZ, you have to make sure that they make an investment in that camera system for maintenance to make sure it's working when it should be. And it has to be updated occasionally when the new technology comes in so that it will be what people expect. What they expect is what they see on TV. They expect to be able to see somebody in a reflection in a person's eye. You, as the security manager, must manage that expectation. That is a very important thing to remember, that you must manage the expectation when it comes to camera systems. So here we are. We're a little bit over. We're at 53 minutes. This is the longest lecture I hope that we'll have this semester, and I apologize, but there was a lot of stuff this week. This week, you read the Baker and Benny text, pages 123 through 152. The text was written about 4 or 5 years ago, at least the printing that we have. Understand that this is technology we're talking about now. Things change very, very fast, and especially in the video realm, more so than the alarms, more so than the access control type systems. Everything is changing in video. So some of the material is already old, and you'll read it and you'll say, that doesn't sound right. Well, we'll talk about those things. But just know that the majority of the stuff is general enough that it will apply. But don't get jammed up if there's something in there that you heard me say, well, wait, Dr. Wisniewski said that's different. Well, it may be different today. And so Drs. Baker and Benny are very smart men, but they can't predict the future any better than the rest of us can. So give them a break if there's something in there that you say, wow, that sounds like old school thinking. It might be. I want you to look over that Axis website. We're going to use those for our projects. So I want you to get familiar with some of the models of camera that they have. Not so much their models, but again, the features of cameras today. If you want to look at Verkada and Meraki, Verkada is the one that really has a very, very, very long amount of memory, time-wise, on camera systems. Meraki is a division of Cisco, and so if you have a Cisco network in your building, they normally put in like power over Ethernet lighting in a building. So every overhead light has a connection to the internet. It's used for energy management, but that also means there's a network of things in your ceiling that you can connect to, and Meraki makes that very easy. You can look at those if you're interested in cameras. Those are two that I'd recommend. The others are good. Look, Panasonic and Sony and all those are very, very good. However, remember that they also sell NetVRs. And if you're selling NetVRs, you have a reason not to push for onboard recording. And I really think that's the way of the future. So take with a grain of salt the fact that they may not have as many models that have onboard recording because they don't sell things if they do. This is a 2-week unit. So the next quiz is going to be next week, not this week. There's no quiz this week. You're probably going to have a little extra time on your hands with the given situation at school. So I'm not going to apologize for going 55 minutes in this lecture, but we will try to keep those down in the future. Everybody have a great and healthy week, and if you need anything, you know where to find me. We'll be in touch. With that, we will see you in week 2 for the next lecture.